Hello and welcome to a new edition of Business Insider. In this episode, we'll be talking about the Egyptian government's strategy in dealing with the globally caused economic crisis as the world, after recovering, or as it was recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic, saw itself in the midst of the Russia-Ukraine war with all its repercussions. So we'll be talking about the effects of that global economic crisis on Egypt and how the government here is dealing with it from the stance of the monetary policy, the mega infrastructure projects that are on continuing to create more jobs, the initiatives taken to try and ease the burden on citizens, the socially oriented initiatives, of course the endorsement and the support of the local components in key industries, the support of key vital sectors like the tourism sector, the talks with the IMF for a new loan, the ongoing economic reforms, and much more. And we have with us here in the studio to discuss all of that Dr. Sahar Damaty, and she is the banking and financial expert. Thank you very much, Dr. Sahar. Great pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. It's my honor.
Thank you. Our honor, Dr. Sahar. Dear viewers, we'll be watching a report on the topic of the episode and come back with our dear guests here in the studio. So please don't go away.
Egypt has many capabilities to face the current economic crisis, especially with a wide range of national projects including infrastructure, agriculture, green energy and transport, in addition to social support programs and presidential initiatives. President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has said Egypt is trying to limit the repercussions of the current global crisis, assuring the public that the country has a sufficient stock of all basic commodities that can meet its demands for many months. The president focused on supporting people with low standard of living nationwide through the presidential initiative Decent Life, which achieved many projects in the countryside. The government has allocated £11 billion as exceptional aid according to presidential directions over the next 6 months to support around 9 million families during the current global economic crisis. Recipients will include the neediest families and pensioners who receive less than £2,500 per month, as well as the state employees whose monthly salaries are less than £2,700. In addition, 2 million subsidized food boxes will be made available each month at half price from the Armed Forces food markets. Meanwhile, the Ministry of Religious Endowments, in cooperation with the Ministry of Social Solidarity, will distribute Eid al-Adha meat throughout the year. President el-Sisi also directed the ministers to add 1 million new families to the Takaful and Karama program, thus increasing the number of beneficiaries to more than 20 million citizens nationwide. The Takaful and Karama program was launched in 2015 to support impoverished families with school-aged children, the elderly and people with special needs in Upper Egypt. Minister of Social Solidarity Niveen El-Qabbaj has said that £500 billion has been allocated in the current budget to support social protection programs. Prime Minister Mustafa Madbouli has earlier announced in May the state's strategy to deal with the current economic crisis. Madbouli announced the completion of an assessment of assets worth $9.1 billion in preparation for offering them to the private sector. The Prime Minister also announced the government's intention to offer a percentage of some projects on the EGX and to merge and offer state-owned premium hotels on the exchange as well. Additionally, Prime Minister Madbouli said the government had allocated £130 billion for direct impacts and £335 billion for indirect impacts of the Russian-Ukrainian crisis as a result of the increase in commodity prices. Madbouli pointed that the state aims to raise the participation of the private sector by 65% during the next 3 years. Furthermore, according to Madbouli, Egypt is one of the candidate countries to be a major hub for green hydrogen and ammonia production, explaining that a new law will be issued to exempt industrial projects in new and border cities from taxes. The state will also facilitate the work of entrepreneurs and the procedures of establishing new companies virtually without obliging them to have physical headquarters.
All right, thank you for staying with us, dear viewers. Back here in the studio with Dr. Sahar Damaty, the financial and banking expert. So, Dr. Sahar, Egypt has a vision to deal with the globally inflicted economic challenges, and definitely one of the most important parameters is the monetary policy. On one hand, you want to fight inflation, which is at its highest in Europe and the US in tens of years, which is also high here in Egypt. At the same time, we saw the central bank, the Fed, raising interest rates very recently, last week, I believe, on the dollar again. Egypt did that a couple of months ago, maybe, a short while ago, and we have nobody knows what's going to be the central bank's next move here in Egypt. We saw central banks in the area, in the Arab area, in the Arab Gulf area, raising interest rates. Well, you also have other, things you want to preserve. You don't want to slow down the investments. You don't want to slow down the private sector or the ongoing construction and other projects. So, how do you see the strategy or the policy when it comes to the monetary policies in Egypt?
Okay, when it comes to the monetary policy, I think what we have right now, I would start by saying that the world has been subjected to an incredible increase in prices of oil, gas, energy in general, as well as increasing the price of foodstuff, which are core for all the economy and for all the citizens worldwide, in addition to increase in the prices of raw materials for production, problems related to the suppliers chain, transportation, and so on and so forth. All of this led to huge inflation worldwide.
The highest in 40 years in some countries.
Yeah. Yes. As a matter of fact, the US is standing now at 9.1, which is the highest in 40 years. Similarly, Europe. They have similarly Asia, Egypt. We are currently at 13.2, which is higher relative to the target of the central bank that is standing at around 9%, which is 7 plus 2 minus 2. So if it's above target. And that was for the June figures. Across the last period, of course, when the Fed goes and increase the interest rate, as you properly mentioned, this have a negative impact because it leads to the slowdown of the economy, and hence it affects the performance of all the stock markets, not only in the US, also in the other countries. But they started increasing interest rates first by 25 bips, then 50 bips, then consecutively 0.75 across the last 2 sessions. I believe they wanted to increase to 1%, however, they withdrew at the last minute because the repercussions are significant in terms of slowing down the economy. So, and increasing unemployment, and also they want to avoid any kind of subject recession, depression, stagflation, and this is the biggest challenge that the world has right now, which is a combination between the inflation and the recession and unemployment, and it is the worst economic problem that can happen. It happened 40 years ago, and it took 10 years to recover. So it's a very bad cycle where we stand. Most of the countries that are pegged to the dollars, like Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf in general, The minute the Fed increases, they immediately increase. Egypt have increased 3% at the beginning.
Yeah. That was a big
monetary
jump,
policy.
right? That was because I remember that during the Corona, the COVID-19, we had taken it down 3%, right?
Yes.
In one single move.
Yes, because
that's what I remember. Yeah.
Because significant sectors closed.
Yeah.
Closed business. So you cannot
And
go below
that was
that.
very successful at the time.
It was very successful at the time. But now you're reversing because you are facing inflation. So when you have inflation, you cannot decrease interest. You rather increase interest in order to curb inflation. That was the whole point. What happened? The central bank increased first by 1%, followed by 2%. That was 3%.
Right.
It was effective, as a matter of fact, and then they stabilized twice. Why? Because of a number of reasons. First of all, the margin between the interest rate on the dollar and the Egyptian pounds was very, very wide. The Fed was at the time around 2% or 1.75, while you had certificates for 18%.
Right.
And there was no issue here of dollarizing, or people tending to dollarize and put money in deposit in dollar deposits. So that was quite good. Number two is that the inflation rates started to more or less stabilize. So that was good. Accordingly, the monetary policy resulted to primarily to stabilize rather than increase again. Situation right now is that we're going to have a monetary policy meeting very soon. This monetary policy meeting will have to decide based on, number one, the inflation.
Why does it have to be a Thursday? If that's a legitimate question, because I always notice it's a Thursday.
It's always a Thursday. I know. Well, it has been the case for years now. Anyway, so the issue right now is that we're awaiting, first of all, the figures for inflation. We know where the Fed stands. They already announced last week. So based on the figures of inflation, the status of the liquidity of the market and so on, a decision will be taken whether to stabilize or to increase interest rate in view of the increase.
So two probabilities here. The third does not exist at the moment at all.
No, forget it. Out of the question.
Probabilities,
two probabilities. So also we have to mention here that increasing interest rate have two impacts, negative impacts in general, not only in Egypt, on the world. Number one, it leads to slow down in the economy and slow down in GDP growth.
Sector,
Of course, because the financial expenses becomes higher, and hence you don't know what to face.
Is
Number one,
less,
you have cost of production is high. Number two, you will have financial cost is high. So this would definitely slow down the economy. So there is always a balance between increasing interest and making sure
in
that
fact,
you're
I guess,
maintaining...
Dr. Sahar, some businesses could go out of work in sharp interest rate increases.
As a matter of fact, of course, very normal, because they will not be able... First of all, when the prices increases, what happens to the purchasing capacity? It goes down.
Right.
Exactly. So you cannot afford a lower demand, at the same time, higher cost. So
that's
how
the
can
inflation recession thing you talked about, that dangerous combination.
This didn't happen yet.
You're right,
But
right.
it might happen.
That's what the world is fearing now.
That's the world, what the world is preparing itself to at this point in time. Accordingly, I believe that next monetary policy will determine the interest rate once we know what will be the inflation for end of July. And we're awaiting this by end of next week.
Right. Dr. Sahar, of course, among the measures that the government is adopting to deal with the crisis is try and get more loans from the International Monetary Fund, and talks between Egypt and the IMF are progressing, great progress in fact, the words of Minister of Finance, Dr. Ma'it. He said that lately on the sidelines of the General Assembly meeting of the African Reinsurance Corporation in Cairo. And of course, if we have more loans, there will be a call for more reforms here in Egypt, in the Egyptian economy, and this could have its toll on the citizens. So while it helps, you know, with the budget, it will have its toll on the citizens. So how do you see the process?
I'll tell you something. As we mentioned, or as we started talking, we said that number one, there has been substantial increase in the price of energy. It went up from 65, which was the budget price at that time.
Yeah, you're talking about oil.
Oil
over 100,
yes.
and or around 115, I think, and then it went down. Yeah.
And then it went right now around 103, 104.
Yeah.
So this is where it stands, which means that you are purchasing the energy for almost twice as much as its price, which requires more dollars, number one. Similarly for foods, similarly for raw materials, similarly for
but Ukraine,
fertilizers.
Ukraine is starting to export. We're reading that Ukraine has started to export. Yeah.
Yesterday they started at last, but because there were sanctions. So in order to allow Russia and Ukraine to export their grains to avoid a major crisis worldwide that, as a matter of fact, the United Nations talked about it, the UNICEF, everybody, that the world will be subject to, it's a starvation situation.
Potentially, yes.
So I think what happened yesterday was good because it was the beginning of around $10 billion worth of wheat will be distributed to the world over the next few weeks.
So if we have an energy crisis, we don't want to have a food crisis. I mean, that cannot be there.
We had that. You had that. And don't forget that we in Egypt here, we import approximately 80% of the wheat and grains from Russia and Ukraine. So we depend on them very highly. India do export, yes, but however they stopped exportation in order to maintain the food for their own country, and they are right. So it is a big issue. Having said that, what I'm saying here, why do we need the money? Because we were forced to buy the material that we used to buy for 200% higher than we used to, which is a big amount. That's number one. Number two, the government had to take significant measures to ensure that the major commodities for Egypt, the inventory storage, allowing the citizen in order to support all the farmers in the plantation of wheat and all of these things. All of this is costing money substantially. From this perspective, plus don't forget some our foreign currency earners like tourism decreased by 35%, coming primarily from Ukraine and Russia. In addition to
this, that's aside from the fact that it was just recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic effects. Yes.
We didn't have time to recover, as a matter of fact, and also FBI, which stopped completely. They fled to the U.S. All the funds fled to the U.S. in order to invest and the bonds over there. Hence, this has led to a decrease also in the foreign currency.
So you see it as I mean, Egypt has a good reputation with the IMF loans. I mean, I remember in 2016 when we free floated the currency, November 2016.
November, yeah.
Yes, there was that loan, and the reforms started strongly. And then during the COVID-19, there was another loan in 2020, and Egypt was described by international organizations, the IMF, the World Bank, and others, as one of the countries that really dealt in a good manner with the crisis, with the COVID-19. So yes, Egypt has a very good reputation. It has a CV, if I may say so, in doing well with the loans. But I mean, more reforms. If we have to lift more subsidies very quickly on some sectors, there has to be a balance. I guess there has to be a balance between applying the reforms and at the same time not making it so difficult on the citizen.
When we got the first loan from the IMF, that was, as you properly mentioned, in 2016, we obtained an amount of $12 billion.
Yes.
In addition, there was a very strong plan in order to cure the major structural problem in the economy. So that was very important. And also among which was part of this reform was to decrease the subsidies in order to decrease the deficit in the budget. Hence, the performance of Egypt 16, 17, 18 was outstanding, which led to the fact that, number one, the rating of Egypt from different international organizations like Moody's, Standard & Poor, Fitch, and so on, increased by 5 notches, which was excellent. We were among the best performers in terms of GDP growth. That was very good. In addition, the reform that was conducted also put a lot of emphasis on the low-income brackets people and how to improve and alleviate the poverty level in Egypt. That was crucial as well. Hence, it resulted in this substantial growth. However, when we were moving up so fast, we were faced with COVID, and before COVID was finished, we are faced with the global crisis.
We had secured 2 loans totaling $8 billion during COVID.
Yes, that was from the IMF.
Right.
But then there was other loans from different
And now,
countries.
it's as we come out of COVID, there is the Russia-Ukraine war.
Exactly, and I explained that it's a matter of that the reason for the new loan, you have to continue with the reform and add to it in order to be able to cure the problems that happened during the last 3 years, 2 years. I mean, you went from COVID, you're now in the crisis, so you really have to put some new structural problems, among which is flexible interest rate, decrease of subsidies again. So this is very important conditions. It's conditional loans. So I believe these are within the objectives of Egypt anyway. However, because of what happened, it slowed down a little bit. So
the reform process itself. It had to slow down just to
face.
That's the balance I guess that has to be struck, right? I mean,
as a matter of fact, you didn't have a choice. It's not a choice that you had. The point is that in COVID, you had, first of all, to make sure to put the proper measures to ensure the safety of all the citizens in Egypt. You had to buy vaccines for 100 million.
And all of this happened perfectly.
All this happened very well. Number 3, you had to enable all the sectors that closed, like airlines and tourism and
tourism-related industries,
and related industries. So this they put a lot of effort and finance in order to enable it to restart and to start operating again. And it's not performing. As we can say that it's performing approximately 50 to 60% of its capacity. It's not 100% capacity yet, and now we are facing a worse problem, which is I'm calling it the world economic problem. The worst. So in this situation,
worse than what happened in 2007, 2008, the Lehman thing, the bankruptcy of the banks, and in the US.
That was
Remember that?
a big
Yeah.
problem, but
Yeah.
we did not have that problem because
We always had a solid banking system here in Egypt. Yeah.
we had a solid banking system that prevented us from falling down like the rest of the banking sectors and the stock markets worldwide. And that was
But what's happening now
is worse.
is more threatening to the world economy than COVID, and then 2008.
Definitely.
And how do you see, by the way, I mean, how do you see the world reaction? You're an expert. You worked with the World Bank before. I mean, how do you see the big powers of the world, their reaction? You said earlier in your speech that the world is preparing itself for this. So is this are we inevitably going down that path, or are we preparing ourselves globally here? I'm talking about the big powers to try and avoid the terrible scenario.
I don't see them avoiding, and I don't see them solving. I'm very sorry. I mean, those sanctions hit Europe much more than they hit Russia. They hit the US much more than they hit Russia. They hit all the citizens in the world that have nothing to do with this, and yet they are watching.
Okay.
I haven't seen them acting.
Okay. So you're an economic expert, and you see that there could be a political solution from the world powers to avoid that bad scenario
To
that
stop
you're going.
it.
Yeah.
To stop it. I mean, what's the point of leaving the world going to stagnation? Look at England today. They are increasing interest rate for the third or fourth time.
Yeah, people are losing homes because of the high mortgage
currencies.
they can't pay. People are losing homes because of the mortgage they cannot pay.
They cannot pay, they cannot survive, they don't have merchandise, a lot of factories are closing, unemployment is increasing, inflation is increasing, you have a threat of stagnation, and you have a threat that there could be no food, especially when it comes, no, I'm not saying scarcity of food with very high prices. There has to be a stop to this. It's not by stopping the war, it's stopping the sanctions.
Yes, yes. And very soon we're going into the winter, and everybody will be needing gas for the heating and so on. Dr. Sahar, back here to how Egypt is facing up. I mean, the time is really running quickly here. Some of the demands by the IMF from Egypt is improving governance and reducing the role of the state and getting the private sector more involved. Now, the government here in Egypt has been calling on the private sector to, for more involvement. We've been hearing that call repeatedly over the last months and maybe a few years. But I mean, how do you see, how is it progressing?
Okay, how it's progressing? It started from May, when the government studied the whole problem and studied the repercussions of Egypt, and the government came with a strategy, a new strategy, in order to prepare itself for a new phase of economic reform. This strategy is built around a number of pillars and parameters, which are, number one, inclusion of private sector more into the economy, and this is going through, I would say, 3 phases. First phase is that the government will get out of around 89 sectors or more, and the private sectors will replace the public sector. The second phase, the second part, will be a partnership, public-private partnership between the public and the government and the private sector. The third phase, some of the strategic and important sector for the government, they will remain in it, but this is a few. So this is when it comes to the inclusion of the private sector. Number 2, the strategy also goes around speaking specifically about all the assets owned by the country, وثيقة ownership of the country, and according to this new document. There is a complete, detailed explanation of how this is going to be implemented and across how long for each different phase. So I think this has been well prepared and already distributed, so we all have this information.
Have you started? I mean, do you see the wheel spinning?
Yes, sir.
Is part of the strategy the initial public offerings of big state-owned companies? That is also a part
of
but
the
this
strategy.
is taking a lot of time. Yeah.
No, it's not taking a lot of time. They studied the situation, they put the strategy, they already published or distributed the documents. As a matter of fact, I have one document with me.
Perfect.
So already they distributed this. I'm sure that this is under discussion with the IMF and the World Bank as we speak. And we're waiting for the IMF final decision, I would say sometimes between September and December regarding the new loan. So this should be coming. Another point very important is to work hardly on decreasing the external debt of Egypt. Not only external, internal, but mostly external, which reached around 158 billion, around that. But however, I have to mention something just to give the public some information. The 158 billion that Egypt owes, dollars, yes, 92% of which is long term, and only 8 is short term.
Good.
So this is from the IMF document, not from information that I bring, from the IMF documents. Hence, there is no mismatches here. So this is important. Number two, Egypt relative, when it comes to foreign currency relative to GDP, we stand around, let's say, 45%, 50%. While you look at other countries,
80%
Japan,
and 90% and
Japan, 257% relative to GDP. US, France, name it, Greece, and so on and so forth.
And I guess the 90% is accepted, right? Anything below 100 is accepted.
I cannot say it's accepted.
Okay.
I'm speaking about the magnitude and relative to other countries where we are. It doesn't mean we are all okay, but what we have in front of us right now is a strategy to deal with the debt across the next period of time to decrease it, whether we're talking about the foreign component or the local component.
I'm very glad that you ended on that positive note, on that optimistic note, and let's hope it all turns out in the best way for Egypt and for the globe, facing those huge economic challenges caused mainly by the Russia-Ukraine war. We had other really things we wanted to talk about here in the program, but I guess maybe we could have you another time, Dr. Sahar, to continue this discussion, please. Thank you very much, Dr. Sahar Damaty, the banking and financial expert. A great pleasure having you with us. And thank you, dear viewers, for watching Business Insider. Please stay with Nile TV International. This is Mohammed Abdelrahim, and this is goodbye.